thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar for our GTEX MENATEX countries and beyond. I'm Matthias Knappe. I'm working in ITC and I'm responsible for our work in fibers, textiles and clothing, including our program GTEX and MENATEX, among others. Before we start with the little opening, let me quickly repeat some of the housekeeping rules for today. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a webinar format. So you can, as participants, can listen, but you don't have the option to open your cameras or microphones or share any screen. If you have questions on the technical presentations to our panelists, please use the Q&A button. So you have various buttons on the bottom. One is the Q&A, which will be dedicated only to technical questions on the presentations. If you would like to network and chat with some other participants or ask ITC administrative questions, please use the chat box. But we are not answering any questions on the presentations which are posted in the chat box. So you please do this in the Q&A button. Time permitting, after each presentations, we might open up also for live questions. For this, you need to raise your hand, and then we can give you the floor to pose any questions you do not want to pose in writing in the Q&A button, but you want to ask directly. We also provide translation. We provide translation from the main webinar language, which is English, into French, Arabic, and Russian. For this, you can use the interpretation button with a little world icon on it and choose your language. Please note that there's only translation from English into these languages. There's no translation between the languages, for example, from French into Arabic or from Russian into French. So I'll keep on repeating this kind of housekeeping rules. I think the webinar will be very interesting. We are happy that you're all here. And I would like now move to the opening. I would like to give the floor to Rob Skidmore, our colleague from ITC, to say a few words on behalf of ITC's management. Please, Rob.
Thanks very much, Matthias. Let me know if you have any problems hearing me or understanding. It's my great privilege to welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen, to this webinar. I think it's going to be a great event, and I want to welcome you on behalf of ITC's Executive Director, Pamela Coke-Hamilton. My name is Rob Skidmore. I'm a Chief of Sector and Enterprise Competitiveness at ITC, overseeing our work in sectors, and textiles and clothing. The work led by Matthias is one of the key sectors for us. If you don't know ITC, we're a UN organization based in Geneva, and our job is to support good trade through internationalization of SMEs. We work with SMEs because we think they contribute to good trade, and good trade contributes to development. So that's why we're here. We're going to be talking today about the Global Textiles and Clothing Program, GTEX. It's one of ITC's most important large programs, given the weight and the importance of the sector globally. It is a global program, but currently it's most active in Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia in the MENA region, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in Central Asia, and Madagascar in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we expect to continue to expand that. And more importantly, the stuff we're talking about today, as you'll hear, has, I think, value globally in countries across the sector. GTEX basically works on two levels. The core of the work is directly with companies, and here we work with them based on their demands, based on what they say they need in areas such as productivity, material sourcing, product development and design. We talk about speed to market, export marketing, linking to new markets and buyers, all the full range of what these SMEs are facing and tied to the markets and their level of maturity in a way. And perhaps most important, we also work with them to improve their social and environmental compliance, and that's a demand both from the manufacturing side and from the buying side. We also work with the ecosystem around the companies. So here we are working with business support organizations wherever they're found, public organizations, industry-led industry associations, academia. The reason is because they create the conditions around which these SMEs can prosper, and they can address some of the sector-wide issues. And one of them we're particularly focused on is getting academia linked with companies so they can develop talent and they can be supported on R&D. Just one note there, core to where we are effective is the partnerships we're able to develop with these institutions. They lead and we're there to support. So we see this across all the countries. I know from my experience, the industry associations, for instance, in Tunisia and Morocco, FTTH and AMIT, have been a really important partners. But they're, as I say, in every geography we work in, and we appreciate this partnership and this shared endeavor. And also at times, difficult conversations where they're moving us to where we need to be. I think GTEX is making progress, but of course we've been very hard hit on the program, and of course even more hard hit have been our clients by lockdowns associated with the pandemic. So this has required our clients, our companies, and the project to pivot very rapidly, and it's been a massive stress test, I guess, to all of us. Part of what we'll talk about today is what we've learned from that process, the tools we developed, and we got some great people to talk to us about what we think the future may look like. So a quick rundown of what we do today. First of all, Matthias, who's kind of the brains of the operation here at ITC, will talk about how the pandemic has affected the work in the MENA region, in Madagascar, and a little bit how GTEX has been working on that. We'll also bring in Ann-Kathrin Zotz, who's with our Trade for Sustainable Development team, to talk about the work specifically on environmental and social performance. And this, I think the demand for this and the need for it has even accelerated during the pandemic. Then we're going to turn the mic over to some really important partners that we have, leaders of industry in Bangladesh and in China, to talk about how those industries, as big as they are, have also faced this, and how they've lived it and how they expect to live it afterwards. We'll take a virtual lunch, so you'll have to fend for yourselves during that. Then we'll come back and we'll turn towards the substantive work that we've done, and we've got a couple of our key advisors here to talk about some of the work we've done on best practices in the industry and specifically on costing. And finally, go to the market side. So then we've got somebody to talk about the US industry and how that's looking post-COVID and even now during COVID, and also the European Union markets. Those are the two big markets we're looking at under GTEX. I can't talk without taking the opportunity to thank our funders. First of all, SECO from the Swiss government has been a key partner in co-developing and co-thinking GTEX. So I want to thank Anne de Chambrier, who's with us, and I think she'll be speaking in a few minutes. I also want to thank the Swedish government through their organization SIDA. They came in to enhance, to extend GTEX, and have been also a great partner, very supportive. And finally, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom has helped us expand even further out to Madagascar. So thanks to our funders, you make it possible, you help us extend our work and make this even more global. So let's get back into it. I'm going to hand it back to Matthias, but I also want to give you a teaser to some work we're going to be doing in 2021. COVID-19 and the pandemic and the lockdowns have exposed massive imbalances in the way that this value chain is governed. We've seen unilateral contracts being unilaterally canceled. We've seen a lot of issues come up. So what we've sensed is there's a need to think about that imbalance and how we can potentially rebalance it. And this will be a dialogue with industry, with our government partners, with all the folks on this call. And that's something that Matthias will be starting at the beginning of next year. I think it's really important for us to take a lesson here and to see how we can rebalance a little bit the way the value chain works, supply chains works, so it can be more resilient and distribute value better and distribute costs better for the next shock that we hit. So again, thanks, great honor to be here. Thanks a lot, Matthias, for letting me take the mic for a few minutes. I want to hand it back to you, and I look forward to a great webinar.
Thank you, Rob, for the kind words, also for highlighting what we're doing in next year also. I think it would be interesting from everybody here. You mentioned our donors, SECO, and I would like to invite Anne de Chambrier to say a few words on behalf of the Swiss government.
Yeah, hello. Do you hear me? Okay. Dear participants of the webinar GTEX, dear experts, dear team of ITC, on behalf of SECO, the Swiss State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, I would like to welcome you to this webinar organized by the International Trade Center. My name is Anne de Chambrier, and I know you are all linked in some extent to the value chain of textile and clothing sector, but from very different countries. I'm impressed how many people are logged in today. So it's a pleasure for me and for SECO to participate and to be here with you today. Why SECO is committed to support a textile value chain? The global clothing industry is undergoing a deep change, partly because of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, but also because of much more fundamental changes and long-term factors, such as digitization, shifting supplier routes, changing consumer behaviors, and climate change. The pandemic has exacerbated the structural weaknesses of the sector. At SECO, we are convinced that it's time now for all actors to come together in building new ways of doing business and in promoting a more sustainable clothing sector. Only together with producers, with buyers, textile associations, consumers, with the public and the private sectors, we will see a change. We have a joint responsibility to further improve the economic model as well as the environmental and social performances of the sector. That's why the GTEX program has been designed with ITC and financed by SECO, but also by SIDA in the MENA region. So we wish you a very interesting day, full of open questions and answers. And we thank ITC colleagues from the organization and the support through the GTEX program. Thank you for your attention and have a very nice day.
Great, thank you very much, Anne, for the kind words. So that brings us a little earlier to the closing of the introduction. I would now like to move in actually to the first presentation, because we are all looking more into the technical substance of the discussion rather than the opening remarks. And actually it will be me who making the first short presentation on the impact of the pandemic and some of the beneficiary countries. Let me try to share my screen, and I would like to get some feedback whether you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Okay, so I would talk to you a little bit about impact studies on COVID-19 on the textiles and clothing sector that we have been doing in 4 countries, or that we also have been participating in. This is Egypt, Madagascar, Morocco, and Tunisia. None of them are complete. There are a lot of different stages, but I think we can give you some indication of what's happening and some interesting figures of where the countries stand. But this is basically just the teaser for the rest of the day, when we then move into the topics which come up also in these impact studies. So let me move from country to country and give you some indications of where we stand. Now starting with Egypt. In Egypt, we did surveys among companies, and we found the following: that about the Egyptian stakeholders think that at the end of the pandemic, about 10% of all the jobs in textiles and clothing might be lost. And this was the figure that was discussed in the stakeholder meeting only about 10 days ago. 51% of the companies that we surveyed applied salary cuts. 80% of the companies who did cut the salaries did so by at least 25%. 40% is the average loss in revenues among those countries that were surveyed. And this is more or less in line with the drop in exports. About 56% of the companies have had order cancellations of at least 50% of their orders. So more than half suffered from order cancellations. 70% of the companies that we interviewed confirmed that they have liquidity problems. Despite this, none of these companies has taken any loans. This says something about the banking system, maybe in Egypt. 50% of the companies have been switching to producing medical textiles or medical garments mainly, personal protective equipment, PPE. And in our stakeholder meeting, we had the conclusion that by the end of 2020, approximately 30% of the orders of the previous year will have been lost, and more than 3/4 of the respondent confirmed this loss in the interviews. So these are some highlights of some findings in Egypt. The discussions are still ongoing, and we are finalizing the reports. We have been doing similar things in Tunisia. What did we find in Tunisia? Well, we found so far that 52% of the factories that we interviewed reduced their economic activity by at least half or even more. There has been a big shift towards the local market. If they cannot export, they sell locally. 70% of the factories focusing now, at least during the first wave, on the local market. About 41% of the factories switched to producing PPE. And interesting, out of this, 87% actually exporting PPE also, mainly masks and gowns. SMEs are specifically hit, or disproportionately hit by the pandemic. 50% of the SMEs had export losses, and SMEs are receiving more export cuts in relative terms than the larger companies. So they are specifically hit. 33% of the factories said that they had stocks of fabric that they bought for the spring and summer season this year, and they can't use it anymore, which is a big liability for the companies. And 50% of the factories also said that they had financial difficulties to either pay workers, rent, suppliers, taxes, and so on. And at least a third of the companies applied salary cuts for their staff. Moving on to the next one in Morocco, which we didn't really do, but we participated in the discussions on the impact study. And here the findings were that about 9% of the annual orders have been canceled so far, especially during the first wave of the pandemic in spring. 30% of the annual orders have been delayed. This is a figure coming from the association. Some of the companies that we surveyed said up to 40% of the orders actually were delayed, and that companies really have very low visibility what's forthcoming. That was during the first wave. In summer it was a little better, but now it's back to low visibility what's forthcoming. I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but it's only about a small fraction, about 1% of the factories are expected to actually shut down completely and won't open anymore after the pandemic. Again here, many companies switching to the production of PPE, about 70%. 85% of the companies in textiles and leather reduced their workforce, especially during the first lockdown in spring. And only about 44% of these companies recovered the entire workforce during the summer. Now during the second wave, we don't have the data yet. And overall, the capacity utilization rate of factories was below 50%. It was about 49%. If we look into some of the findings for Madagascar, which is just in its initial stage, so we don't really have that much of representative figures, but we get some trends already. And we can say that, that 20 to 30% of the orders that the company surveyed have been canceled. And there's an overall decrease of orders coming in. All companies face heavy increase in transportation costs. This is local transportation, but this is also the shift towards air freight, because Madagascar has been suffering from reduced shipping frequencies to the island. So many of the companies need to ship by air, which increases the cost, of course. There's all the companies are facing revenue drops, but there's a big difference between companies. But we see a revenue drop between 15 and 50% per enterprise. And all the companies need to reduce labor costs, like in other countries. And this is done by applying either voluntary salary cuts, up to 50% for some staff, reduced working shifts, sending workers to technical unemployment, and also to ask staff to take annual leave. Again, move to production of PPE, and also a shift towards sustainability. Social and environmental sustainability is believed to be important afterwards, so companies are preparing for it right now. So these are some of the qualitative data we found by interviewing companies. If we now just look into statistics, and these are the export statistics from the selected country in local currencies, we clearly see a big picture. We see exports are dropping, about 26% for both Morocco and Tunisia. And this is for the first semester 2020 as compared to the first semester 2019. 18% in Madagascar, and about 23% in Egypt, but we already got the figures for Egypt for October, so January to October, and has been going down to only minus 19% from January to October. This is probably something also happening in the other countries if we get more updated statistics. If we now look into the import side, and look into the big markets, the US and the EU, we see here the US apparel imports from January to October 2020 as compared to the same period last year. We see that, and you look at the red line shows you the overall average of reduced imports from the world, which is about 25%. Morocco and Tunisia have bigger drops, but they're not exporting very much to the US market anyway. You see some of the big competitors, China, suffering quite a lot with minus 42%, but you also see that countries like Madagascar, Egypt, and Turkey, for which the US market is relatively important, doing relatively better than the world average, but still substantial reduction in demand. And a big competitor in Asia, Bangladesh, only in hyphens has minus 11.6%. Same thing now for the EU market. We see a similar picture with some statistics I'm not 100% understanding, so don't ask me a question why. We see a big drop in imports coming from Morocco, with about minus 68%. Also Tunisia, minus 48%. Same for Egypt, minus 48%, as compared to the average drop from the world, which is about 31%. We see China doing particularly well with only a minus 2%. So this is very interesting. But this is for the data January to June 2020 as compared to next year. Something to be thought about. Now let's have a little outlook on country plans. So all the countries are preparing for the future, and looking into the different country plan, one can see common things. And these are mainly the common things we found here. So there's a low visibility, as I mentioned earlier, of what's forthcoming. There's low demand foreseen until mid next year. For example, the Egyptians also think that by the end of 2021, we will only recover 80 to 90% of the pre-COVID levels of exports. 67% of the Egyptian enterprises believe it will take more than a year to recover. And 60% of the factories in Egypt also tell us that they receive new orders, but these orders are smaller than they used to be in the past. Another aspect Rob was mentioning, Anne was mentioning, digitalization becoming very important now also with the pandemic. Everybody's looking into it. We talk about marketing and sales, that's the e-commerce part, but we're also looking into digitalizing the entire supply process, from fabric sourcing, product development, production, logistics and distribution of the product, linking to the systems of their buyers. This is something all the countries are looking into, especially looking also into see what they can do with e-commerce. So 28% of the companies in Tunisia already started their digitization and e-commerce endeavors, and 50% of the companies in Egypt said we need to do it. Third point is nearshoring. So at least in the MENA region, there's a big hope that this will help recover the sector importantly in the future. So, and this with regard to the closeness to Europe, but to some extent also to the closeness to the United States, because shipping time from the Middle East to the EU, to the US East Coast is still lower, faster than from Asia to the US. Necessary conditions, of course, are that companies need to rearrange, if they haven't done it yet, their export procedures to be able to do smaller production runs with quicker delivery times, because that's the whole purpose of nearshoring. And the backward integration is also a big obstacle still, since some of the countries, or most of the countries in the MENA region, do not have a very strong textile base. So there need to be a textile base. And this could be either done at local level or possibly also the regional level. Another aspect all the countries are looking into is market diversification. Yeah, they have realized the few markets we have presently, and especially if they are French, as they are France, Spain, or Italy, poses problems. So we need to diversify. Yes, we need to strengthen our presence in the existing ones, but we also need to move to new markets. Within Europe, probably more towards the north, towards the United States, if you're not really exporting to the US yet. So for example, Morocco have a free trade agreement with the US, but also beyond 2021 to look into Africa and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and what it brings with it. So this is also an important aspect. And market diversification, I mentioned it earlier, is also something with regard to the local market, because in Egypt, the companies told us 40% told us that we are now selling and we are buying more from the local market. Something else, country branding and marketing. Everything, all the countries would like to do it to reassure existing buyers, to attract new ones, and also to attract possible investors. We look into product diversification. All the countries want to do. PPE is one thing, medical garments, move to new niches for small runs and quick delivery with regard to nearshoring. And COVID wear, I call it COVID wear, but everybody still looks into sportswear, casual wear, and loungewear as something to continue to be important in 2021. Reducing costs, I think this is very obvious in the companies. I'm not really going into this one. It's at the company level. It's at the government level with regard to different taxes, VAT returns, duty drawback schemes, and what have you. And it's also a strong focus, and this was mentioned by Rob, it was mentioned by our donor SECO, Van de Chambrier. There's a strong focus on sustainability that all the countries feel. There is a pressure from the market, so we will need to look into the aspects of sustainability and make sure we comply with this new trend so that we have more advantages than our competitors. And this basically brings me to the end of my presentation. And I think, I don't know, I have not seen any, the Q&A thing. I can respond maybe in writing to some of this, but the aspects of sustainability is actually the next presentation we will be doing. And this presentation will be done by my colleague Ann-Kathrin Zotz, who is working in another section in ITC and working on trade for sustainable development, with whom we have been very closely working to support companies to improve their resource efficiency and their circular production capacities. Ann, welcome, and I give the floor to you.
Great, thank you very much, Matthias. Thanks for everyone for joining us today. I see we are numerous and the number is still increasing. So yeah, my name is Ann-Kathrin Zotz, and together with also our joint colleague, Delphine Clement, I think many of you know her perfectly, we will present you now our work on the resource efficiency and circular production component. And let me just share my screen. Yeah. So good. So very quickly we will jump into this. First of all, the circular or resource efficiency and circular production component really tries to make the business case together with the SMEs and the different stakeholders for going or implementing sustainable business practices. We look there at the water, energy, chemical and waste production within and consumption within the enterprises, and try to raise awareness, knowledge, but also capacity to implement sustainable business practices. We also are contributing and have contributed already to the knowledge and training of local experts who are intensively working together with the SMEs to identify resource efficiency and circular production measures, and ultimately also to formulate strategies to implement those. And then finally, also this component supports the enabling of institutions to even further support SMEs in becoming more resource efficient, implement circular production, and ultimately to become through that more competitive. Why going green? As I said, we want to really establish the business case for going green, and the benefits lie within 3 different areas. So firstly, of course, savings can be made by optimizing resource consumption and also better managing resources. The resource dependency is being reduced. I mean, in many factories, we have seen a large dependency on, for example, boreholes for water, or an electricity grid which might be failing. And hence, when the resources are better managed, also that dependency on perhaps unreliable sources can reduce the associated risks. Then, of course, the compliance with environmental regulations can also lower any, let's say, potential financial impact this can have by avoiding any potential fines. And it can give access to new financing opportunities, especially when we are looking at green financing. Then when we look at the business opportunity side, when implementing resource efficiency and circular production measures, You're also meeting better the environmental sourcing requirements, which we will come to in a bit, and which are getting stricter and stricter as we are seeing. Then we can also already see that new products are being developed by looking into how to, for example, better recycle or reuse waste. And it improves also the reputation above unsustainable companies, which might not make the same efforts to become more resource efficient or engage into circular production practices. And then ultimately, of course, besides the, let's say, more economic benefits of going green, there are environmental ones, such as the contributing to the fight of climate change and by reducing CO2 emissions and the overall environmental footprint. But as we know, it's always better to make also a good convincing business case to really drive action within the private sector. For the global trends we have been seeing in, let's say, the last years, we really want to point out those which we see the strongest pronounced. So one is the demand for, of course, increased traceability, transparency, and sustainability. So consumers asking where, by whom, and how is my garment made, which raw materials have been used, and how is the environmental footprint of all this. So we see this really as a result of large consumer-facing campaigns, but also, of course, by a more and more complex production network, so a much more fragmented supply chain, and also through, for example, the geographical distances within the supply chain. Hence, it's much more difficult for the end consumer to know exactly how the garment was produced and by whom. So the responses by the private sector, we can see, are setting high goals, high standards within their own supply chain. So to the public, we see statements communicated, such as, for example, by the Inditex group, saying a use of 100% sustainable cotton before 2025, or by H&M saying by 2030, we're aiming at 100% recycled or other sustainably produced material. And then by PVH, we also have a similar statement. So, and the list goes on. Many companies have gone forward with those. And as you see, the clock is ticking. So we are approaching those deadlines the companies have been setting. And to really, let's say, be able to be held accountable for that, because the media is also not sleeping, we see much more stricter requirements. And we highlighted on the bottom that more than 90% of those targets set by companies are actually environment-related targets and can be very specific also. So we see larger buyers very much being specific and, for example, saying we want X amount of carbon emissions to be reduced, or we want all our suppliers to purify or recycle their water when they're, for example, engaged in the denim sector. And on the other hand, we also see, or on top of that, we see stricter environmental and supply chain related regulations and laws at the destination countries. So we have here a little timeline showing what kind of laws came into place when it comes to environmental and social criteria. And we see now even more of those coming up. So we have also in Germany now the so-called Lieferkettengesetz, supply chain law, which is under discussion. We know at the EU level, there is also the discussion of having much stricter common criteria for global supply chains. And hence what we see is that international textile and fashion retailers and brands are anticipating exactly those regulations coming into place and also complying to those existing and the response is with stricter requirements for their own suppliers. And all this we see much more pronounced actually, or even further through COVID. So we see the reduced demand of garments, leading retailers even further to consolidate, of course, their supplier base. Matthias had just shown the reduction in demand. Of course, that means many suppliers are not only receiving less orders, but perhaps no orders from certain buyers. And this is paired with, for example, financial stimuli, which are available in the origin, but also destination countries, and which also set out social environmental targets to build back better. So we see there, let's say both. On the one hand, a consolidation of the supplier base. On the other hand, we see economic stimuli which link, let's say, financial support to social and environmental targets. And hence what happens is that we have retailers and brands even further enhancing their sustainability related goals. So in terms of circularity, carbon emissions, water footprint, and also, of course, these brands and retailers engaging or wanting to engage only with the best performers among their suppliers, who are meeting all their commercial requirements, but also their social and environmental. So when we have a large buyer reducing their supplier base, let's say from 100 to 50, those 50 need to meet all the different requirements or in the best possible way they have set forth. So within the link between, let's say, these trends and our resource efficiency approach is really to help the suppliers now to comply with all these new requirements and to make, let's say, for themselves the best possible business case out of this. So on the one hand, really trying to keep continuing their commercial relationships, but then of course also to see themselves that they save their costs, that they perhaps engage in new business opportunities, such as producing new products. And we do this by having a 4-step approach where we start with really collecting company-specific data in terms of energy, water consumption, and waste production. And then we make a gap assessment. So comparing their performance against, for example, the requirement of an international buyer or the percentage or an objective the company itself wants to set. So for example, improving their energy consumption by 20%. Or for example, by a regulation coming up saying you have to phase out a certain chemical that can be your benchmark. That means you cannot use that chemical anymore. You have to find ways and measures. You have to implement changes in your company to comply with that kind of goal or to meet that kind of target. Then after having done undergone the gap assessment, the companies are supported through their local coaches to identify and plan for resource efficiency and circular production measures. These are then compared through a cost-benefit analysis to really see, is it financially feasible to implement a certain identified measure for the company? So is it like that the company might be able to fund that through their own cash flows? Do they need external financing? And what is actually the return and the payback period of that? And then finally, all these results are being summarized in a resource efficiency and circular production strategy. And along with that, a communication plan is designed to actually be able to communicate all the results to the internal stakeholders, but also external ones, such as financiers. So with that, I will give over to my colleague, Delphine Clement, who will walk you through the results we have so far achieved under this project.
Yeah, thank you, Ann-Kathrin. So we, with this coming slides, we want to provide you with an overview of what is currently happening on the ground, you know, with our beneficiary companies, part of the whole GTEX MENATEX program. So at the moment, we are working with 61 textile and clothing SMEs in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and Jordan. And they're all working in several different subsectors: fast fashion, denim, knitwear, technical textile, and injury. And at the moment, we are working with, we have hired 15 experts on resource efficiency and circular productions. Thank you, Ann-Kathrin. The countries are at a different stage, you know, within the coaching program. Morocco and Jordan companies have already finalized their own RSTP strategies, and Egypt and Tunisian's company are still in the process of the coaching program. But here we have a snapshot of some of the measures that we have been reading in the RSTP strategies and that have been identified by our experts on RSTP in the different countries. So in terms of water management, what are the typical RSTP measures that can be applied? For example, it could be installing a wastewater treatment plant, reducing the volume of water used during a dyeing bath, and also possibility of reusing this water. In terms of energy efficiency, our RSTP experts suggest identifying, removing air leakages, insulating the hot surface areas, installing LED light bulbs in the factories, also revising the contract power and the tariff with the electricity providers, and also installing, if possible, a solar power system for electricity generation, and also looking at the machineries and sometimes replacing old sewing machines to gain in productivity and efficiency. In the waste management area, some measures suggested are installing, of course, a monitoring system of waste production, so companies can assess the volume of waste that they have and how they can then recycle it or dispose of it. This can be done through contracts with licensed partners who can recycle on behalf of the companies. And also in the waste management, you can also, companies can find some new business opportunities by textile upcycling, so transforming the textile offcuts or leftovers into new products such as cleaning clothes or reusable towels. So as mentioned before, some of the countries are not at the same stage of the program, but here we would like to show you some preliminary results that have emanated from the coaching program in Jordan and Morocco. Here, these results capture some of the environmental benefits that can be generated through the implementation of RSTP measures, and also financially, what are the volume of costs that could be avoided by the implementation of RSTP measures. So the Jordanian experts have highlighted the importance of installing LED light bulbs that could save some 60% from the electricity bills, and also installing more efficient machinery could save 30% of energy consumption in the factories. In Morocco, the experts identified several measures that you see here. For example, installing a storage tank for water reuse could save up to almost 30,000 meter cube of water, then translating into saving approximately $50,000 for the factory. The use of a heat exchanger to recover thermal energy from effluents and cool the wastewater before it arrives at the water treatment plant could save approximately 15,000 meter cube of water, thus also saving approximately $27,000 for the company. I will not go into all of them, but for example, also installing LED light bulbs into the factory could save 41,000 kilowatts, thus saving approximately $4,000 for the company. Next slide, please. So now we would like to show you in the next slides some visual examples of best practices that are currently being implemented by some champion companies we met in our beneficiary countries within the GTEX and MENATEX program. Here in Jordan, you can see that from the packages of fabric rolls that the company receive, they manage to sort different types of waste, enabling the company then to recycle these different types of waste. So on this slide, you can see how the leftover textile can be reused as a new product. So that by grinding the fabrics, by producing then fillings, the company can manage to reuse and sell some filling for pillowcases. Same thing for the paper that is being used on the daily production processes. This paper can be compacted, made into cardboard, and can be then reused for packaging. In Tunisia, a company is currently also doing a lot in terms of recycling of waste, especially plastic waste. Here you see the different process, the different stages that regenerate the plastic into a new product. So from collecting the plastic, separating it by different type, by reducing the plastic, you can make plastic scrap that is then transformed into a new product, such as plastic tubes that can be sold to other companies and reused into other industrial processes. The same company is also reusing some sludge from the wastewater treatment plant. So instead of leaving all the sludge from the washing process into a landfill, it goes through a different stage in order to recover this sludge and transforming it into pavement. And finally, as you know, the water footprint of some of the textile companies is a key environmental hotspot that is very much scrutinized by international buyers. And here, a Jordanian company has installed a system of water purification in order to limit the release of harmful chemicals to the environment. So these were some examples that we have witnessed in some of the different countries we intervene. And of course, we are encouraging through the RSTP strategies, our companies to assess the possibility of replicating these kind of best practices into their own strategies.
Thank you very much, Delphine. Perhaps just to finalize this part of the presentation, we would like to point out a few lessons learned so far. So firstly, we really need to make the business case for sustainable business practices. We see this really as a key driver for companies to implement the measures we are suggesting. And for this to happen, we see three different factors. So one is the quantitative analysis of each of the sustainability measures being identified, which then translates into hopefully also bankable projects or to be discarded, so either or. Then we need a very clear linkage between the financial and commercial implications of unsustainable business practices, so losing market and not having access to finance, if we continue with unsustainable business practice, a part, of course, of the adverse environmental impacts. And then finally, how important it is to work within an ecosystem. So as today, to have, let's say, all actors around one table and really discuss the way forward is key. So we strongly want to encourage, again, the inclusion of technology providers and as well financiers in this discussion, especially when it comes to sustainability, as these are key to move forward. So with that, we can open up for questions, and thank you very much.
So thanks very much, Anne and Delphine. There are no questions really in the question and answer box. I don't know whether, maybe we can allow one question if someone wants to raise his hand or her hand. But then we move to our next presentation because we are slightly behind of 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Do we have one, Jana?
I'm allowing them to talk, please. Here we go. Manana. Here we go. Hello, please go ahead. Okay, we have another question here. Please go ahead, Anthony. Microphone's on mute. Okay, we've got Dr. Gayatri.
Yeah, hi, thank you. In one of the presentations, I have seen that the ITC is supporting the suppliers to raise up to the expectations of sustainability from the international buyers. So how do you work with the suppliers? Like, do the suppliers have to approach you, register with you and get an assessment done? How does that work, basically?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Perhaps to directly answer, these suppliers are already part of the GTEX MENATEX program. So all of those enterprises can express their interest in being part of the specific component on sustainability, or more specifically resource efficiency and circular production. So in this way, we contributed to the overall program, but they were of course already part of the GTEX MENATEX.
So the new suppliers, do they have an option to work with you? If any new supplier would like to work with you, if they're not already registered?
Yeah, so this question I think would be for Matthias to answer.
No, I think we need a structure behind it. The structure as a project. So when we have this project in place, then we will be able to work with the companies. Because we also involve companies directly, but we also would like to engage with local institutions where we can build the capacity and to replicate the activities in more than just a couple of beneficiary companies.
Okay, thanks so much.
Sorry, I need to stop this conversation now. There is the question and answer box. Please put your questions there. Ann-Kathrin and Delphine will be happy to answer this in writing, and then everybody can see the answers posed and the questions given.